So hello everyone, my name is Terence Johnson and I'm the creator of the Vampyr Resistance Corps, here for a very special panel to talk about all things vampires, and I will let my two wonderful guests introduce themselves. To my left I have...
Will Linn, Executive Director of the Joseph Campbell Writers Room and Chair of the General Education Department here at Studio School.
I'm John Bucher. I'm one of the instructors in the Joseph Campbell Writers Room. I'm also a narrative analyst and consultant and a writer of novels, screenplays, and books.
Awesome. So yeah, we're here to talk about all things vampires because I just made a vampire web series and I wanted to get some people with deep understanding of the mythology and of those worlds to just have a fun conversation. So my first question is what was your earliest experience with vampires? When was the first time that you had heard of a vampire?
I first heard of a vampire in the most campy way possible.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a little boy, my family fell in love with a really campy movie called Love at First Bite. And it was the classic story of a vampire that falls in love with a woman, but it had more of a tone similar to Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein to it. And that year for Christmas, I asked my parents to get me a doll of a vampire. And I, to this day, don't know where they went and found a doll of a vampire,
Wow.
but they found a classic Bela Lugosi doll they gave me for Christmas. And I took a photo of it, and I 40 years later wrote a book about vampires, and that photo, there it is, yeah.
Yes, we have the book.
That photo is actually in the book of me at a very young age holding.
Oh yeah, let's get a nice steady shot here.
We're gonna have to zoom way in order to get that. But that is neat.
Cool.
That's great.
Yeah. Loved vampires ever since I was a little boy.
I don't know if I do not have such an amazing personal story, but my honest answer is I think The Count from Sesame Street. I think that was...
Okay, yeah.
You know? And by the way, the Jim Henson exhibit was just in L.A. at the Skirball, so I saw The Count again recently. It was pretty cool. But also another very campy vampire experience. And actually, maybe an interesting setup for the point that as spooky and scary as those characters are, they make for really fun and funny characters too.
Yeah.
What's the recent one? Besides Family Fang, another great vampire, actually written by my writing teacher in college. But then what's the other one that just happened? What They Do in the Shadows?
Oh yeah, the Taika Waititi movie.
I love funny vampires that aren't scary.
Yeah, I think The Count would be the first for me. The one that's popping up in my mind is sort of like an indelible image. Do you remember Tales from the Crypt would used to do specific VHS tapes of specific longer sort of features, and the Bordello of Blood is the thing that I remember seeing.
I was significantly scared of that. Yeah.
I went to my aunt's house for some family reunion, and she had that movie, and I watched it, and I was like, "This is crazy." That was a lot for a 9-year-old to take in, because those movies were a lot of really interesting content. Yeah, so it's funny. So we have sort of the campy version, the kid version, and then the not the adult version. And one thing I always wonder, I feel like vampires are number one on the monster food chain, in terms of storytelling. And
I don't know if you know, by the way, that actually Count Dracula recently surpassed Sherlock Holmes is the most storied figure in all of literature.
Oh, wow.
There's been more stories written about Count Dracula than any other literary figure. For years it was Sherlock Holmes, but Count Dracula recently surpassed Sherlock Holmes.
So they definitely are, my facts are correct, they definitely are number one on the monster food chain. And I sort of was wondering, what is it about vampires that's really captured the imagination? What is it about that myth that has sort of made it, even as somebody, I'll have to answer this for myself because I created this whole series about vampires. But like, what is it about that makes them so compelling?
Yeah.
Well, there are lots of interesting stuff, but the first and most culturally relative answer is obviously that it's a Christian shadow. You know, you drink blood to resurrect, you know, and you're undead. You like have this, you know, you're in a tomb, in a coffin, and then you resurrect, just like the story of Jesus resurrecting and the communion blood that is that agent for our resurrection. So in some ways, it's kind of this shadow that's an exact description of the Christian idea of the resurrection of the corpses when the day comes, and the blood is the blood of Christ is the path to immortality.
There's a really interesting history even behind sort of the connection to vampires and Christianity, in that in the 8th century, the Greek Orthodox Church began preaching that bodies would not decompose when they were buried unless they had received these certain rites. So it sort of began this mythic tale all throughout the villages, you know, throughout Greece and Italy and all these places, that there are these beings whose bodies will not decompose. They are destined to walk the earth forever. And from that sort of mythic seed, we get vampires, we get zombies, we get lots of different undead. The other thing I'd add to that I think it's really something that attracts us to it, is that idea of immortality, that I would rather face walking the earth for all of eternity than face whatever
only lovers left
beyond.
alive.
Yeah,
At the very end, and I won't give the end away, but yeah, that's the choice.
It's the choice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, for me, I mean, the genesis of my web series was I was doing research on phenomena that happens in the world, and I stumbled across this thing called midnight sun, which is an area where the sun never sets. And I was like, what can I do with this? Yeah. Like, what is interesting about this? And it was like, well, what can't go out in the sun? Oh, vampires. So, like, what if I had a story about, like, a vampire war where, like, in midnight sun time, you got this break, and that sort of developed it. But then I had to go back to the mythology. It's like, in order to make that work, my vampires can't go out during the daytime. So, like, what does that mean for, you know, just in storytelling in general, but what does that mean for the vampire characters? Like, so all of my vampires in the story are evil because I didn't want to have any nice vampires. But I think what was really compelling about them is, for me, I've always looked at vampires as, like, these superhumans. Even though you have, you know, stories where they're way, way supernatural and they can turn into bats and do all of this crazy stuff. Like, I just loved the idea of sort of the True Blood, the Vampire Diaries-esque vampires that look like us and, you know, go around the world like us, but they're just super strong. They need blood to eat in order to survive, and I found that really compelling.
That whole, like, looks like us thing is actually one of the real global motifs around vampires. So a lot of times there are these figures, Philippines, all over the place, where it's this beautiful woman a lot of times that's in the day, and then at night transforms into something else. And then in a lot of these stories, maybe we'll come back to this point, that there is this, like, bat, or half the body comes off and it travels, or some kind of the soul leaves the body and travels at night, which is an Egyptian idea, which is, well, many cultures have this idea of the soul traveling at night, or the shamanic flight of the soul. And so that's mine.
Yes.
Shit, sorry.
Go ahead and turn that.
See, I knew we'd come back to that later.
Yes. All right, back to the shamanic flight of the soul.
Should I just jump back into that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so you know, you have these ideas of the decapitated head, the body that comes off, the bat that flies, some sort of winged creature that's very much like a bat that travels in place of the being, and it's kind of like the Basol in Egypt, where the Basol leaves the corpse at night and travels and then comes back and rests in the corpse at night, like the vampire rests in its coffin and then leaves in the form of this bat.
Yeah.
But anyway, this idea of the vampire very much being a human-looking creature is global. It happens all over the place.
Well, to build on your thought about the feminine origination of vampire and the woman, it's really interesting because when you look at the word vampire, it actually is very similar to several Slavic words, but almost everybody agrees the origin of the word vampire is this Turkish word uber, U-B-E-R, which literally translated means witch. So we sort of get this feminine idea from the very origins of the word. And the story you're talking about, some people think that sort of is the real catalyst for our modern idea of vampires.
It's funny, if you turn to the Encyclopedia of Things That Never Were, they suggest that the first vampire is Lilith, a succubus. And
from
so
the Talmud,
it draws this idea in of the vampire. The blood-sucking vampire is very much related to the succubus, or anything that kind of draws off the soul or that essence, which you then see in Delilah, who takes the strength from Samson. It's the same motif of taking the strength from something and living off of it.
Yeah, well, I think that's interesting because I feel like in modern times, we've sort of gotten away from like the female vampire being the head. Like we mentioned, Dracula being the number one, figure in literature. You have you have your Twilights and your True Bloods that focus where it's like we do meet female vampires, but they are not like the big bads.
Not enough Queen of the Damned.
Yeah, you don't get a lot, and even Anne Rice, Lestat is her main character. In my series, it's funny because one of our co-workers, Katie Northlick, who's an actress, actually plays like the vampire queen of Alaska, and I didn't put that together until now that I was like, oh yeah, like the reason why I wanted her to do that is because we don't see too many like female vampire head hunters, and so, which is so fascinating given, I feel like the myth has taken a turn, at least more modern, even though my understanding of some of the origins is like, the vampire being like the sexual creature and the piercing of the neck being like a symbol for like taking somebody's virginity, and so how that has sort of shifted more towards men being like representative of vampires rather than the women.
It's an interesting thought. I do think there's something to the idea of how when we have female vampires in our culture, we tend to sexualize that. It's the sexy female vampire, when actually I think the origin of the female vampire, back in Romania and these villages, it was more this crone type figure, this old woman that would feast on your blood and your body.
And if she looked pretty, it was totally a spell.
That's right. That's right. So I think it's interesting. It says probably a lot more about our society and our culture right now that we need female vampires to be sexy if we're going to buy into it. But I think the better story is with the crone-like vampire that can occasionally turn into that sexy.
And those crone figures show up all related to vampires all over the world. We mentioned the Philippines, lots of vampire stories in the Philippines. But where these witches do some wild stuff, like trick other women into eating cooked blood, and that turns them into the figure, or they then can turn somebody into the figure by blowing down someone's back of their neck. Really weird stuff. Or another story where they put blood in a bottle and then make a little miniature 2-inch vampire woman out of the blood in the bottle. Lots of weird ones, but lots of crones and beautiful women. And this is, again, if you look at Pandora, she's beautiful on the outside and very bad and dangerous on the inside. Not that all the women in that mythos are, but that's what she represents. And this is a flip from what's happened where this is punishment to Prometheus for stealing fire, but for tricking Zeus. And the trick is he's made this nice looking feast on the outside that's actually bones and stuff on the inside. So it's again this repetition of this beautiful looking thing on the outside that's ugly on the inside, which is a huge motif around the body itself, life in this world itself. And so when you're talking about these animated corpses, these blood-sucking, undying creatures, it draws in this larger conversation about life in the body in this world as a fallen life, as a fallen world. And so the seduction of the beautiful woman into something that's actually not as good looking as it looks, that's a recurring motif around the idea of the seduction of the soul into the material world, it turns out to be a lot more suffering than we thought when we just thought it was going to be fun and feel good.
Yeah. Is that what you think contributes to why vampires are scary just in general? Like the idea of like your soul, like the seduction is their scariness more religious based?
I think bloodsucking is always scary. Drinking, but it's turned very scary. But
well, I think it's interesting because, with this series, I wanted it to have a very sort of specific mythology about the vampires. So, like, the vampires can bite you, but you won't turn unless they kill you. And then I was like, okay, so if that's the case, then I need all my vampires to be evil because I want them to be scary. And when, like, my characters leave this sun zone and they have to deal with these vampires, you see that they're more powerful. But, with a lot of supernatural creatures, just by virtue of television, is like, like Penny Dreadful. Like, the vampires in that were really, really scary. And then you saw Dracula at one point, so you're like, oh my god, like, what is going to happen now? But then you have something like True Blood, even though there are scary moments, like, those vampires are not scary, they're meant to be more sexy. So, like, I guess my question is sort of like, where did the scariness of that tale come from, and how, have we moved maybe on from that?
Could I speak to that? Because there's something really interesting about vampirism, that it transcends gender, sexual orientation, everything, right? You see vampires, especially in our modern culture, that of every different persuasion, every race, every type of identity. So it tells us something about the psychological sense of what this means. So in the 1600s, when we first start seeing sort of tales of vampires, 200 years before Bram Stoker makes it popular, in the 1600s, you had these fables. And this type of story was unique in that fables were not meant to tell stories of two opposing people. So you have, like, you ever heard the frog and the hare?
Yeah.
Or the tortoise and the hare.
Tortoise and the hare.
Yeah. So everybody knows this story. It's you want to be like the tortoise, slow and steady wins the race, rather than like the hare that gets lazy. That's our modern interpretation of a story like that. They knew back then, those stories with two characters in a fable, those were about two presents inside the same person. So the way they understood a fable was to say, inside you is a tortoise and a hare, and you need to make sure that the tortoise is equally represented with the hare inside of you. Same way with, like, town mouse, country mouse. Same way with vampires. Basically, what they were saying is, there's this part inside of you that wants to feast on other people and take their life. And how are we going to kill that? How are we going to destroy that? So we see a lot of the legends that come out with stakes to the heart and things like that, garlic. All of those things sort of had a connection to a deeper meaning of why those things would be effective in stopping that process within yourself. So I wonder, even in your show, if you think about it in terms of metaphor of, like, could it be, that the vampires represent one side of the inside of one person, and then other characters in the show represent something else?
Oh, that's really interesting, because I feel like the vampires in my series represent, like, a clear break in humanity. So it's like, when you become this thing, when you succumb to it, when you are brought into it by violent means, like, you've given up humans. There's no way to go back. And it really allowed me to put the human characters in more stark relief, because when you see, they get into some really petty in terms of, like, there's a vampire war going around, and now we're arguing about, like, whether somebody made a decision because they're in a relationship with another person, and what does that mean? And the vampires are like, they just don't care. So it's really an interesting dichotomy of being like, what's important. But then, like, you also have to have that balance as a human, and that's what makes us human, versus turning off all of your emotions. It's really interesting that you brought up, like, garlic and stake to the heart, because when I often find, when you create a monster that's really powerful, you got to find interesting ways to kill them and to get them out of there, or to give your humans advantages that they wouldn't normally have. So in this series, we went with the stake, and the silver, but then we sort of were like, if this were in the post-apocalyptic world and we had to, like, scrounge resources and we were sort of going back to the earth, I thought was a really interesting thing. So we have like a silver aerosol bomb that's like silver particles that will choke a vampire for like the 2 seconds that you need to stake them, or like an ultraviolet light bomb which will stun them. And as we were developing the series, I remember I pitched, I was like, what if we have like Wolf's Bane? And they were like, where are we going to find Wolf's Bane? That's not realistic in Alaska. But it was really fascinating to think of these creatures as like others, but then also be like the thing that will kill them is like something of the earth. They're like this otherworldly creature. So the thing that's going to kill them is something of the earth.
So it's something of the earth that threatens them. And so they're like, well, first of all, silver, it relates to the soul. And vampires are soulless, and this is why you see no reflection either, right? And so this kind of tendency to think of a disembodied mind, the hyper-logical, hyper-rational, it's an interesting plague in the Western consciousness that is one of the tensions going into the vampire. I just realized I walked into something that has too much nuance for me to unpack. Because there's this complication where they're both very much represent the body and they're very sexual, but they also in some ways don't feel the pleasure themselves. So there's this conflict between how they both represent the seduction of material opulence and all the things that somebody would want, they would desire and crave, yet at the same time there's this like lack of soul and participation in it. So when you bring in the earth as that thing that threatens them, I wanted to get simple and go one way down that path, but there's a complication because they both represent that earthliness and represent a kind of detachment from it.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge when you're thinking about when you're doing anything supernatural related, because there's like all of this wonderful lore. And so I didn't even realize that I stepped into that when I was creating it. We were just like, what are we going to do to kill these vampires and give our humans an advantage? Because in the series, it's only 3 humans going out, very like Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, like they have to go down into a tower to try and find somebody and find something. But like you also have to be very practical about these things. And I just read this book called Strange Practice, which is about a descendant of Van Helsing who's now become a doctor in London, and she's taking care of the supernatural community there. And there are 2 vampires in that story, one of whom is very like, I love this life, and one of whom is sort of loathing it. So that was a really interesting thing to read.
Yeah, you have those characters that like they're always familiars, or people that are desperately wanting to become vampires is another really recurring thing. I really am interested in what you're saying about that split part of the self, and how there's this part of the self that is this kind of almost a personification that coagulates all the things that we've identified as the evil to repress. That it is that thing that wants to feed on others, that is very seductive, but actually we acknowledge that it doesn't actually experience joy either. It's really these characters become an opportunity to concentrate and focus on those qualities that we want to identify and resolve. And it's interesting how symbolically we end up with symbols like the silver bullet as something, or these things become indicators, symbolic expressions of how to deal with this psychologically too. So like the silver bullet, silver is related to the moon. The moon is mortal. The moon dies and resurrects over and over and over. Well, in some ways, catching the vampire with the silver bullet is like having the mortality that the moon represents finally catch up to him.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But there are lots of little things like that where they're almost little symbols, not just for how to get rid of the vampire, but how to get rid of the vampire.
Well, and the blood is another, because when you think about the blood being consumed, being sucked out of someone, there's sort of this alchemical process that turns that blood into life for the vampire. Also, the religious idea of transubstantiation, of the blood actually bringing life to the soul, becomes a really interesting psychological idea inside of someone to, it begins to make you question, okay, does what gives me energy, must it be taken from someone else, or are there things that are the other outside of that can bring life to me? it's big questions.
We get caught up in the idea of the conservation of matter, which then becomes the conservation of energy, but it's even older in the form of the conservation of life.
Yeah.
Do I need to eat something's life for me to have life? Is there, limited, life energy out there? And if it's a limited system like that, can I get more? It's very different than an approach of resonance and amplification, where abundance is not necessarily something you have to take from something else, but that's one of the core psychological complexes that there's the vampire, is that's how the vampire sees the world. There's this limited good, and it's got to get it from somebody else.
Yeah.
Blood's good stuff, though. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's very much in line, in the hope that my series will continue on and go on forever and continue working on it. But one of the things that I found really interesting was, like, if that concept of, like, the blood, I need the blood, so, like, that's draining the humanity from somebody else to try and maintain some semblance of your humanity, because these vampires, they live lives, they do, but they're just evil.
There are in Tibetan too, there's Tibetan vampires that actually, like, have even helped Buddhas at a moment and live these kind of normal lives, but are vampires. Those exist stunningly all across the place. And Tibetan has a lot of great vampires. The wrathful deities all drink blood out of these skull cups. And while we're talking about blood power, can I show you a couple props?
Yes, I'm here for the demonstration.
So first of all, this is a communion cup from the Garden tomb in Jerusalem. Wow. And so, of course, we know that the blood of Christ, or the wine becomes the blood of Christ. So I'm playing around with a vampire character that actually can live on communion wine. And hunts other vampires. So then here's another thing. This is from the oldest genetic people in the world, the Maasai, and people that study the vampires normally come across the Maasai because they drink blood from their cows, and they normally puncture it with an arrow in the jugular and take blood and mix it with milk, and they put it in this calabash, and this is a real ceremonial calabash used to mix blood and milk. So that's a common practice, and actually in Nepal they also have a blood drinking ceremony of yaks, and thousands of people will come to drink the blood of a yak that they drain yak after yak after yak after yak, passing cups after cup after cup around thousands of people.
Oh, wow.
And of course, not every social justice organization supports them. Here then we have Koba, just one of many Mesoamerican pyramids. That is where they would have done blood sacrifices. And so they sacrifice often war prisoners, and the blood is believed to sate, and whether it's Aztec or Mayan, it's a combination of the kind of vegetation and the war god. So why are the vegetation and the war god related to each other? The battlefield and the grain fields were the same. The blood of the battle was conflatable with the red water of the Nile, the red water of the Adonis River that flooded the floodplains and became that they were both the battlefields and the grain fields watered with the blood of people or watered with the red blood of the Nile of the Adonis River. So you can see how there's this conflation of the grain then with the people. And of course the Grim Reaper, why does he carry a sickle? Not because he's cutting down grain, but because we are the grain. And so this ancient association of the battlefield with the grain field shows up with these war and fertility gods, vegetation gods. And so thus the sacrificing of blood to the field in the same way that you wanted the field to be watered by the Nile. And so that was the blood of the god.
Well, there's this Greek term called pharmakos, and it's where we get our modern word pharmacy, where we get medicine. And the word in Grecian culture meant someone that we take outside the boundaries of the city once a year and sacrifice to keep the gods at bay. So this idea of blood being the sacrifice that keeps the gods happy, I think it plays back into this idea of the vampire. I think in some ways the vampire represents that other being we put our sin upon in society.
And we project into psychologically.
Yes, we project into psychologically, push outside the city, and we need to kill that being in order to be okay with the supernatural. this continues all through even American folklore. The Appalachian Mountains, they had this idea of the sin eater, someone that would come in and eat the sin, of the town. So I think we have this idea that we're constantly looking for someone to make us okay.
Scapegoat to sacrificial lamb. Scapegoats kind of become interchangeable, and then also Ravana, who drinks blood and keeps a big vat of a jar of ascetic blood, and he's the bad guy in the Ramayana, the Hindu epic. He is, what was I supposed to say about him? Oh, they burn effigies of him as a symbolic, same Burning Man story. Or you might have seen The Wicker Man, same thing, same stories.
Cool. And so we've had a very good conversation. And so to sort of wind this down, what's one of your favorite vampire tales and why?
I'm going to go with something a bit more controversial.
Mm-hmm.
I really, really liked True Blood.
I did the first 4 seasons.
Yes. The first 4 seasons, I would agree.
Yes.
Yeah, after season 4, things got a little odd, but I liked the idea of vampires forming their own cultures and what would happen within cultures as far as hierarchy goes, as far as respect. Vampires who had been on the earth much longer than other vampires and who had been through historical moments had hierarchy over those who had not. I felt like they explored some really interesting ideas aside from the sex and the violence of the show that a lot of people watched it for. I felt like they did not short us. This whole idea of creating True Blood is something that would keep vampires from having to feed on human beings. That's a really interesting idea. So I loved True Blood.
They should have just taken communion.
They should have taken communion. I like it.
I don't know. I really love vampire movies, and I watch like a lot of them whenever they come out. I like it, and it's actually speaks to the power of the character that there's not one monolithic character or example in my mind that is why I love vampires. It's not like the one. I mean, I like them all, and some of the ones that I enjoy the most are some. I thought Van Helsing was fun. I thought, and I thought that actually Underworld, the battle of vampires and werewolves was fun. That was the old medieval idea that werewolves would go into hell and battle the vampires, and I always liked that. And, the vampires in The Matrix were fun. I like them everywhere. I like the vampires all over the place.
True Blood is one of my favorite shows of all time. Yeah. So I really loved that show. And the books, I felt like the books ended a little stronger than the show did. I really liked Penny Dreadful's take on vampires. I thought that being in that world, even though you have all of these famous, literary characters, you have Dr. Frankenstein, you've got Van Helsing is in that, and Dracula pops up, and you've got all of these Frankenstein's monster, and it was just, and Dorian Gray, but that they were these things that could come in the night and just kill you, but not before tormenting you for a while, which is what they would do.
Can I add one other? I'm sorry, you're going to get me pumped about vampire. But there was a Swedish film called Let the Right One In.
Yes, I love it.
Oh, there is a favorite. Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Let the Right One In is probably my favorite modern vampire tale. They did remake it in the United States. I didn't think the remake was nearly as strong as the original Swedish film. But Let the Right One In, I think, is the most fascinating and the most psychologically terrifying idea of a vampire in our modern film canon. I just love it.
I know that one too.
I've got to add Kronos, Del Toro's Kronos, because that one brings the immortality complex of the vampire into the front. It's Philosopher's Stone meets Holy Grail meets vampire, and the way that it brings together those mythologies into a singular thing, or more importantly, notices that they're already participating in the same thing and gives them an opportunity to work together. That was pretty cool. I love that one too.
I think that's what I found really interesting about A Strange Practice, because it's you've got this Lord Ruthven has been living on the earth for 500 years in London, and what that must be for him, but then he is a vampire potentially terrorizing the city. And so, yeah, that's really, I love Let the Right One In. I don't know why I didn't think of that one right off the top of my head. Because that's a great movie.
It's a great movie.
And by the way, you know that when a older rat is connected to a younger rat, the blood of the younger rat does indeed rejuvenate the older rat.
Ooh.
So,
isn't that the same thing with when you get a blood transfusion? It's like
that's right. You want that young blood. They want that virgin blood, like all the vampire stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I want to thank you guys for joining me. It's been a really great conversation about vampires. I love talking about all of this. So, for the people who are watching this out in the world, where can they find you on social media, maybe, or get your book, or yeah.
First and foremost, look at the Joseph Campbell Writers Room, which you're going to be seeing a lot of.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I work for the Joseph Campbell Foundation as head of their mythological resource database. So check out the Joseph Campbell Foundation website for all kinds of resources on myth. Surely tons of stuff on vampires as well. Or you can look at Mythology Channel or mythosophia.com.
And I echo everything Will said about the Joseph Campbell Writers Room. That's going to be an incredible resource for people that are interested in any sort of mythological beings. But you can follow me on Twitter at John K Bucher, or check out my website at tellingabetterstory.com.
Cool. And you can follow more about the Vampyr Resistance Corps on the at VRC Series and vrcseries.com, and then you can follow me, Terence Johnson, at Lenoirauteur. That's Lenoirauteur. And so for the three of us, I want to thank you for watching.